Welcome to the BFIS podcast, where today we are joined by Professor Ger Gauss. In his book Natural Born Learners, Alex Beard described Professor Gauss as Jean-Jacques Rousseau meets Willy Wonka. He's a brilliant educational thinker, a champion of true learning, and a wise and wonderful human being. Well, having read this, I was looking forward to meeting Ger and to hosting this episode of the BFIS podcast, when a familiar situation for me arose, and my best laid plans to podcast were sidelined to a very important arising issue that took me away from the conversation. So I left the episode in the capable hands of our Director of Development and Alumni Relations, Kyrie Kellerwan, and University and Careers Counsellor, Rhonda Leshman. Both work with BFIS alumni and have experience working with international independent school students who are thinking about their futures. As we think about children's aspirations for becoming all they can be, being readily available to reinvent that through their school career, lives and experiences, Professor Gauss is now advocating a future awareness campaign in partnership with the World of Work to globally introduce careers education in elementary education. He frequently reminds us that children can only aspire to what they know exists, and that there can be a poverty of experience that comes from both an affluent upbringing and the one that is less so. I recently watched an early childhood class of 3 and 4 year olds build an airplane and organise themselves to dress up and take various airport roles. The discussion about their roles, who would take them, and role-playing in earnest lasted and evolved over several days. As colleagues in the airport and as friends, they navigated the world of work. I was arrested by a 4-year-old security guard on my visit and given a ticket for being too tall to get on the plane. Security wearing police hats had just navigated a difficult discussion amongst employees about whether or not I should be arrested, ticketed, or prevented from entering the plane. In the end, she went for all three. And meanwhile, another worker was boldly placing chalk marks on the wall to indicate height restrictions. Now, this is an example of experiential learning at this age. A trip to the real airport might be a great next step for this class. This is what Ger advocates for. He was the founding global education director at Kidzania. From Dallas to Tokyo, Kidzania is an interactive city made for children 1 through 14 that combines inspiration, fun, and learning through realistic role play. Kids can independently explore a scaled indoor city of over 7,000 square meters with more than 100 exciting careers that they can try at each location. They have 26 facilities over the globe, from Mexico City to Tokyo to London, and Kidzania receives more than 10 million visitors a year in over 23 countries, and 9 more facilities are currently under development. What can we learn from them? It's an exciting concept. In 2007, Ger Gauss became the founding chief executive of the Children's University, and under his leadership, the Children's University became a multiple award-winning international charity, providing 5 to 14-year-olds with exciting and innovative learning opportunities outside school hours. The Children's University global reach now extends as far as Australia and New Zealand, China, Malaysia, and Singapore, and the Middle East. A number of important awards have been conferred on Ger, including an OBE, and he is a frequent speaker at global educational events and works with schools of all types across the world. I hope you enjoy our episode.
I think the importance of future pathways, and I use the term future pathways as a thinking process, not as a school subject. Right? Please don't make it into a school subject. But it's a thinking process. It is about connecting. It is about enabling children and young people to begin to see why they might do certain things, and because they understand purpose, why they therefore might like certain things more. And the reason I want it to be a sort of as a thinking process is because it doesn't stop. It isn't a project that has a beginning and an end. So that's one reason. And I think the other thing is, please don't call it careers education. Because I think if anybody who's watching or listening, if they're going to be honest with themselves for 30 seconds, the minute the word careers education is mentioned, in my experience talking to many adults, it either generates laughter or expletives. And I think so the term is perhaps contaminated. The future pathways concept is about answering certain questions that are very basic, fundamental questions about schooling and education in general. So in my previous job and in my current work, I travel a lot. And wherever I go, I make a point of talking to young people and children. Quite often, I think the younger the better. And the question I ask is, why did you go to school? It's a very simple question. And this is not scientific, but strongly experienced and anecdotal. I would say about 80% of the answers contain the phrase, because I have to. And I think that's a really sad answer. Now, I'm not incidentally advocating that the pure reason that children should go to school is to serve the economy and the world of work. I do think schooling and education is about serving society, of which the economy is a part. But nevertheless, the purpose piece is very important. And that kind of leads me to reflect on, for example, when I was a youngster, my maths lessons, I had absolutely no idea why I was doing maths. And I remember my maths teacher, I grew up in the south of the Netherlands, near Jongstra, standing at the front and doing his, if A is 3 and B is 4, what is C? And I remember sitting there thinking, that's a language I don't recognize. And I wonder why I should be interested in actually knowing that. And that became a process, particularly in maths and in the sciences, and I turned off. I didn't enjoy it. Now, I was a big football fan as a youngster. I still am. And I love Barcelona, right? And the one person in Barcelona who is more connected to Barcelona, who is more important to me than most, is Johan Cruyff. And as a young boy, I used to go and watch Johan Cruyff play for Ajax Amsterdam in the heyday. And I knew that Ajax Amsterdam and much later Barcelona played in triangles, constant triangles. It's about creating space, isn't it? If my maths teacher had said to me at the time, I'm going to talk to you all about Ajax, and I'm going to talk to you particularly about Johan Cruyff and total football and how it operates, because it's all about triangles, I would have been in there. I would have been wanting to do overtime. So my point about creating the futures awareness thinking is, we as schools, and not just schools, every adult around the child has the potential to spark that kind of thinking. Because one of the jobs that we have is we need to get to know our youngsters better. I think in this day and age, one of the biggest challenges we have as schools and as adults in general is we actually don't know our children that well, because our schooling in many cases is still set 200 years ago. In the days of the Industrial Revolution, when we had to produce mass, we had to feed mass employment. So therefore we had to mass school. And quite often at the age of 14, as the Scottish comedian Billy Connolly often says about his schooling, at the age of 14, his school gates opened. And at the same time, the gates to the shipyards opened as well, the shipyards on the Clyde. And so what happened was you had the mass stream from the school into employment. And in many ways, it's a generalization, but our schooling hasn't changed that much, because we still teach to the masses. We have very big schools. We try within that really hard, but the principle in the end still remains that we haven't personalized enough. And if we're going to be really clear, as all the adults concerned around the children, how well do we know our children? Well, actually, we know whether they're bright or whether they may have special needs. We know whether they are better in some subjects than others. We know their estimated grade. We know whether they're good attendance. We know whether they're naughty or not. And after that, it kind of finishes. And I think when we talk about personalization, we need to talk about much more, and we need to talk about insights. And hopefully in a little while, I'll come to some Kidzania research, which talks about insights, because when we talk about insights rather than data, we must be prepared to look in very unexpected places to find out things about our youngsters. And incidentally, what I don't want to do is to go down that really silly thing whereby we call them generation something or other, right? Because I thought some years ago when we were at generation Z or Z, I thought we'd run out after that because I didn't think there wouldn't be any more. But apparently they just go back to A again then. And I think by putting whole generations into a box, we're actually back to that industrial revolution idea, whereby we expect everybody to behave in the same way. So the personalization side of things becomes very important in this future pathway things.
Mhm.
And we need to begin to think around schooling our children like building scaffolding, right? So we build scaffolding around every child, and every child will have slightly different scaffolding.
Mhm.
And the reason we need to build that scaffolding is so that they themselves can climb as high as they can or want. We need to move to the point where children and young people feel that they are writing their own narrative of the possible. Once we've achieved that whole thinking around future pathways and what that means in a maths lesson, in a languages lesson, in a geography lesson, or new subjects, actually becomes a very cool process, particularly around technology.
So that we can compare and contrast, and you can build on each other's. Because I can see Rhonda nodding a load. So I want to know what did Gare say that made you start nodding vehemently?
So many things are going through my mind in terms of making learning relevant. First, I think of my own story. And I grew up in suburban Michigan, and I was seeking out internships as a high school student on my own. I was very curious about what the working world was like. I did not want my learning to be confined to the classroom. So I was working for a political party, volunteering in suburban Michigan. I lasted one day at Burger King, and then I found a different job. And I would just find these opportunities for myself, and really had this comfort level with older people, and I think developed different skills. And I see that hunger in our students. They're like sponges. They want to know what the real world is like, and creating these linkages to what they're doing in the classroom is absolutely key and relevant. I was nodding a lot as you were talking about Total Football, because I'm a big Ted Lasso fan, and they had a whole episode of introducing Total Football strategy. And I think you're right. I think if a lot more were tied in from classes and material to how is this relevant? How does this translate into real world? That is really powerful. To your comment about students and what do we know about students, and we know that they're very kind of minimal basics. I'm really excited about something that's just been introduced at our school, which is a psychometric profile, psychometric assessment. It's actually based in the UK, the Moresby profile. Yep. Where students really learn about their aptitudes, their priorities, their study interests, and how this links to choices they're making now about IB courses and careers. And I'm thrilled that so many of them were coming to these these kind of feedback meetings with me, with their parents, and just the looks on their faces of discovery about themselves is really, really powerful.
That's really interesting. I mean, the different forms of finding out who our young people are incredibly important, right? First and foremost. I think what we must include in that are emotional aspects, because this is not a mathematical exercise. This is also about emotional buy-in. And I sometimes wonder, I was speaking to some people in the US the other day about when we talk about mental well-being, and I'm kind of beginning to think that it's at least as much about emotional well-being as it is about mental well-being, and the emotional thing often gets ignored. So I think, for example, there are some very simple things that we could do. Instead of asking young people what they want to do when they grow up, or what they want to be when they grow up, we should ask them who they want to be like when they grow up, because that role model aspect it will lead into all sorts of places, but it has an emotional connect, and it is very often about values and principles. And actually, I became a teacher because of values and principles. The values and principles of my German teacher, who one day, I was a very naughty boy, but he rescued me and he gave me a book and he said, I think you're better than the rest. I think that you should read. And I went, oh my God. And I read the book, and the next day I went back like Oliver Twist and went, can I have some more? And he said, I was so hoping that you'd come back. Keep that one. It's just next to me here now. And then he gave me the other. So I think the emotional side of things in all of that is incredibly important. And I think the other thing is that when we find out information about our youngsters, sometimes we need to look at what can they tell us rather than what should we ask. So I'm doing some development work at the moment with a friend of mine called Ben Mason, and he has something called My Global Bridge, which to all intents and purposes it's a LinkedIn for young people, for teenagers and younger. And it allows them to profile themselves self-critically, emotionally, rationally. And so in a sense, and this, I think this thinking around My Global Bridge will go a very long way, incidentally, and there's discussions with government in Scotland and so on. But for me, the important part of it is the information we gain from our young people about themselves is more often than not the information we ask, either in writing or in questioning. When we give them the opportunity to volunteer their own information, we may well discover things that we'd never thought of. And I think it's about finding the nuggets that may well drive that whole thinking. And it'll take us time, right? If somebody says you need to have all of this in place in the next 6 weeks, I'm going to run a mile because I think those things take time, and they need beautifully, I think, the buy-in of everybody. My wife is a head teacher of a school here in Sheffield, it's a primary school. And the school is in an area where people are up against it. And the mantra of the school, and my wife's mantra, is every child is everyone's responsibility. And I think we just need to have, all of us, we need to have that in the back of our mind and in our heart, actually, and begin to look at, well, so what can the parents contribute? What can the wider community? What about the grandparents? If I wanted to have a discussion about the world of work in Sheffield and what's changed, Sheffield, the world centre of the steel industry, not ever so long ago, the grandparents of Sheffield have a great deal to offer in terms of what our children can learn. So those things that we need to go and see and create that connect. And once that environment is created, we then need to trust the young people to make of that whatever they want and whatever they can. And that for me is the beauty of future pathways as opposed to careers or education. And good for you that you're well down that way, because I think it'll make an enormous difference.
Well, the other thing we're developing here is an internship program for students during their holidays and summer to go into a working environment, perhaps have that mentor. So we've seen some mentorships develop and understand what they're learning in school skill applies, seeing if a field that they were curious about really is a match for them. And as we well know, maybe they have some preconceived notions of where they want to be, and it's not a match. And that to me is equally as valuable. Do you see the value in doing internships? Like I know, Kidzania went to age 14. So I was curious, what are the experiences that would be pivotal, impactful for student, 14 to 17?
I think the real world, right? I'll come to Kidzania in a little while, because I want to go to that research and what that means and what that means beyond 14 as well. But everything is connected to what the real world is, if we try and have that in our minds. So what we need to do is, I love that concept of internships for young people. I think I'd encourage you to go younger than 14 when you're ready, right? Mm-hmm. And then I think the other thing to remember about work experience is the word experience. So my eldest daughter, some years ago, wanted to become a primary school teacher. So I was fortunate enough with her school to arrange an extended work experience internship. Junior internship. And after a number of weeks, she came home and said to me, "Dad, if this is the last job in the world, I will never do it." And it was very interesting, because the reaction of her school was to write to her and say, "We're very sorry that your work experience wasn't successful." And I wrote to the school and thanked them for helping me put this together, and then said, "But I beg to differ. It was immensely successful, because for the very first time, probably in her schooling, she was put in a position where she could make up her own mind." What a success. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we need to also kind of build into the real world, but we also need to put in there that bit that goes, when you fall over, you need to learn how to get up, because that's also in the playground of future pathways, isn't it? So I think, and my only thing is, I always think, now I was secondary school trained, I'm a German teacher by trade, and I also became Benjamin Button. So I became increasingly convinced that whenever I found an issue, that the answer was to do it earlier. So I now work with my friends at the Fondazione Reggio Children, for example, as an advisor in Reggio Emilia, world leaders in terms of thinking around early years and play. And the reason I'm doing that is because they turned me into Benjamin Button. I kind of see that we do things in a very odd way in our schooling system. So if you build a house, you build a foundation, don't you? You put a lot of effort and a lot of resources into your foundation so that you can go as high as you possibly can, and you can do that safely. In the world of schooling, we spend most money on our youngsters when they're about 15, 16. So that's like building the roof first. It's an odd way around, and I think we need to be, as professionals, with our parents, I think we need to be really courageous and say some of these things. So I would advocate that we should start future pathways thinking at the age of 7. And the reason I think 7 is such an important age is because you can start to talk about it and play around it earlier. But I think 7 is such a key age because so many youngsters become more confident readers and more confident writers at the age of 7, or from the age of about 7, and that is a key element in the development. So perhaps before that we go that future pathways is about play and dressing up and all sorts of things, and that from the age of 7 it turns but only please marginally, it turns marginally more academic, and I think that piece is important.
That reminds me, I think last year here at school, the primary school, they had small groups of kids interviewing professionals. They sat around the security guard booth and asked them questions.
Yeah.
You know, I think they were like in 3rd grade or something, 4th grade.
Yeah. And we could be doing that every year on year within different areas, different industries. And I'm curious to know how you both train in terms of keeping up with what is the fastest changing aspect of this education, because we have to talk to them and help them open doors to all kinds of worlds. And this is where I wanted to bring in your thoughts again, Gail, on technology. But, you know, how do we as staff, usually this role is 1, maybe 2 people in a school if you're lucky.
Yeah.
How do we as staff, how do you see staff training, developing? Rhonda, you might have some ideas here on kind of things that you're interested in learning about. What's the best way to remain upskilled when this is all in the hands of a few people, or do we have to take a more systems approach?
Well, I'm really happy that this is a new focus for my work this year at BFIS, is the careers program, because I believe in it passionately. Having internships, getting out there in the world was really important to me. But so there's a variety of sources, just, you know, reading relevant reports, jobs of the future, and the internet, talking to my colleagues. I'm on lots of different professional Facebook groups where we're always sharing information. And then of course, conferences. Most recently, I was at the CIS forum on
Council of International Schools.
Yes, the Council of International Schools annual forum. We met in Dublin, and on international admissions and guidance. And they did have a couple sessions. One in particular was about enhancing employability and how schools and universities can nurture and support skills for future careers. So I was able to engage with speakers from the university side, specifically University of Liverpool. Mike, the dean, was there from Parsons Paris, and we talked about what this looks like from the university perspective, but also what schools are doing, the WorkX programs, the internship programs, just creating opportunities, but with a focus on what is the future of work? What are the skills that employers are looking at in the future? And how can I make sure those are kind of the skills that students are developing and aware of and relates to work? They can't just think about it as a job. They have to be aware that there are certain skills that employers are looking for.
Yeah.
And they're really different than the traditional skills from years past.
So that's where the C's come from that you mentioned earlier.
Right. The C's, the big 3 C's: caring, connecting, coaching. I mean, I've been talking to students, specifically grade 10, who are just doing their IB course selections and making sure that they are aware of, jobs of the future. And of course, not just jobs, what are their own aptitudes and strengths, and making these connections so that things are linked together and they're not making decisions in isolation. But just to have a little bit of fun and get them to broaden their perspective, I showed them a video about jobs of the future that did highlight these skills areas. And one growing job field is going to be distraction prevention coaches.
We all need that.
Yes.
Yes.
But we're so distracted by our devices that we're going to need coaching. And also more and more people working from home, setting up work environments that make it conducive to work. So, these kind of coaching professions will have some applicability. And I think I already talked about the interface of like technology and with machines, but there's going to have to be a human touch to it as well. We can't just let machines and AI go rampant. They're going to have an interface to it. So these are some of the areas that I've tried to open students' eyes to. So they realize, they see the bigger picture. They're not just in their own bubbles. Also, this whole idea of personal data brokers, right? All of our personal data that we put out there when we answer questions, when we go to certain websites, our data is going to be treated as a commodity, just like there's stock brokerage bourses, there's going to be data bourses. So, but still there's going to be a need for the human touch, regardless of how technological our society becomes.
Right. And leading back to what Gail was talking about with understanding and the uniqueness of each person, we weave in that storytelling to our students about, you being good at something means that also you can be prepared for jobs that will be changing, developing, growing, because you'll know yourself. And us being able to see them for who they are will help them remain flexible, remain agile in a changing world.
Absolutely. And the Morse-P psychometric assessment that most of our grade 10 students did, it taught them about their own priorities. What's important to them? Is it security? Is it rewards? Is it making a contribution to the greater good? So there were 8 different priority areas, and they really learned for themselves. And it was fascinating to see the results. But also the aspirations questionnaire, what they want to pursue in higher ed. But some of these questionnaires might change in the years to come. They will be able to redo their profile in the future because they will change. But it was quite powerful to see how much they learned about themselves to make informed decisions.
I think it's quite straightforward. I think most solutions are simple. We just have a habit of overcomplicating things, and sometimes I think we do it deliberately, and sometimes I think it's become habitual. Let's make it complicated. I think one of the things that we need to do, not just in the area of the traditional careers education, let's call it future pathways now, is the question, well, who is the teacher and what does the teacher do? And that is, I think that's an ongoing question that we all need to ask ourselves. So I think that in the area of future pathways, we need to stop looking at the teacher as the purveyor of knowledge. It plays a part. Of course, it plays a part. But I think we need to look much more at the teacher as the knower of his or her children, and then the project manager of those children's experiences. So essentially, it is something like marry the approach of the Fondazione Reggio Children with Kidzania's experiences and bring that into the school. Yeah. So that we can advocate work experience for 7-year-olds. I said that once at a conference, and all the health and safety people fainted. That was very funny. Right? And it wasn't going to be about incidentally dragging hundreds of 7-year-olds into a factory. It was much more about bring the experience of the world of work into school. right? So we developed this kind of program that we clumsily called Futures Awareness, which was about, I suppose, something that we talked about earlier. It was about connecting the school to the real world through the medium of horizons and widening horizons, and then letting the youngsters draw their own conclusions, right? So I think that's really important. Technology in all of this is vastly overrated, hugely overrated. I think technology is immensely important. Imagine how much awe and wonder you can bring into a classroom using virtual reality and all sorts of forms of technology, right? Including social media. Totally. But if I go to one more of these expos where every stand tells me that their piece of software will solve all my problems, I'm going to cry. Because so we must stop thinking that technology is the answer. Technology with brilliant teachers will provide solution, and hopefully solutions that fit the nature and the being of different learners. But it's not the answer. The pace of technology is, of course, immense. And I think that's an issue, just like the thing I just mentioned about becoming the project manager of the project leader of children's learning and future pathways experiences. I think the same will apply to technology. My 18-year-old daughter is technologically far better equipped than all of her teachers, right? And my 18-year-old daughter could teach her teachers how to produce TikTok videos and all sorts of things much better. She's not about content. She's also not very much about safeguarding. So my advice would be, pay your 18-year-olds to teach your 5-year-olds how to make TikTok videos, and think of the role of the teacher as the leader in content terms, and the lollipop person in terms of safeguarding terms. So we need to, instead of sticking plasters, we need to constantly go back to our roots and say, well, why are we doing this? Why can't we do this differently? And why can't we think differently? And that's the solution. Historically, in the Industrial Revolution days of schools, historically, what we would do is we'd appoint more people. We need another coordinator. I don't think it is about that. I think it is about making the existing resources even more brilliant. And actually, with that comes trusting the professions, right? Just trust the teachers. They just, they know what they're doing, right? So give them the license to be brilliant. Stop putting them in boxes and giving them titles. So it is around that, and a school like yours with your context, and I know you do this, you should be getting your kids to talk to astronauts and all sorts of things. And I'll tell you an amazing story. When I started an organization called Children's University, which was all about children voluntarily learning out of school, and they collected credits and passports, and then they would graduate at a university in full caps and gowns with their parents there. And it was a social mobility NGO. Okay. And at the University of Bradford, we hosted an event on a Saturday, and there were 2 cosmonauts. They happened to be in Bradford through some European Space Agency program, and we got them to come and talk to primary-aged children, and it was amazing. And I was just standing there watching the eyes getting bigger and bigger, right? And this little girl called Lucy, at the end, she was 9. She asked a question, and she said to this cosmonaut, "If it's so good, do you dream of it?" Can you imagine that question, right? If it's so good, do you dream of it? And he said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "What's your dream?" And he said, "It is the Earth rise, and it's blue." It was a room full of 9, 8, 7-year-olds. You could have heard a pin drop. The size of the eyes were like saucers, and you could see what was going on in their heads and their hearts. That's Future Pathways. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing that Future Pathways then does is it widens horizons. We need to twitch curtains. We need to open windows. We need to widen horizons, because children can only aspire to what they know exists. Mm-hmm. And if you come from a socioeconomically deprived area, for example, you will have had very limited life experiences. So therefore, your horizon is very narrow. So what we need to provide are the experiences, the provision of the experiences alone, and then please don't test them at the end of it. The provision of the experiences alone is enough to turn switches. And that's what we need to do constantly. We need to constantly be on our guard, and we need to do it every millisecond. I often say to teachers that whatever lesson you're teaching, if you deal with an abstract, the next 2 words should be "for example." Because immediately you begin to make the learning visible. The minute you make the learning visible, you create the potential buy-in. You could create the rejection, but that also is an emotional statement. I'm going back to my maths lesson. If A is 2 and B is 3, what is C? For example, if I take Ajax and Johan Cruyff, and I would have gone bingo, I'm in. So it isn't just, and we need to know this, and parents need to know this, it isn't just about the big moments. It isn't just about inviting the astronaut in, although that is one of my favorite stories in my whole life, which incidentally is only about 45% of the jobs. 55% of the jobs in an airport are backstage. So instantly they can't aspire to what they don't know, to what they haven't seen. So it becomes the airport's job to open its doors, to get messages out there. If they want to recruit, they need to let people know what's out there. Yeah. And then there was another thing when I did say to those youngsters, kind of my mantra, I suppose, children can only aspire to what they know exists, comes from. I was education director in an area called Wythenshawe in South Manchester, next to Manchester Airport. And at the time, about 20 years ago, it was the most disadvantaged council estate in the country and one of the largest in Europe. And it sat next door to Manchester Airport, which is one of the fastest growing companies outside of London. So, and Manchester Airport's wish, and which is why they got involved in the project, was they wanted to recruit their future workforce from their doorstep, not from miles away. It all made complete sense. So they kindly funded my salary, and I had an office in an airport, which in itself was an immensely aspirational place to be. And I went and talked to children in the schools in Wythenshawe. For those who don't know Wythenshawe, incidentally, the Manchester United footballer Marcus Rashford went to Button Lane Primary School in Wythenshawe. So you can also call it Marcus Rashford land. And I was talking to lots of primary age children, I don't know, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, and asked them the questions, tell me the job you can do at the airport. And the answer I got were the things they could see. Look, you can fly planes. And the answer I got was, people from here don't fly planes. And that tells me that it is never the children who lack the aspiration. We do that for them. And so that's kind of where that came from. And then many years later, I conducted a piece of research in Kidzania. Kidzania City is built for children aged 4 to 14, where they can experience the world of work. And each Kidzania has about 60 activities, has a real aeroplane and a hospital, a television studio, you can clean windows, you name it. And when the children come to Kidzania, they learn independently. So they get a bracelet so that we can track where they are, just in case we need to get hold of them. And then what I did, I went to the analysts and said, so I know which activities they've logged into. I want to know what the first activity is that a child chooses on their first visit with a school. And I want a huge global sample. So the sample stands at nearly 600,000 across 8 or 9 countries. And then I wanted to know, who are those children who've made those choices? Are they boys? Are they girls? Are they black? Are they white? Rich, poor, urban, rural, 4, 14? Which country are they from? And the answers, the key issues became, and this will now make sense in terms of the conversation we're having. The key findings were, all stereotypes are set at the age of 4. Pilot activity, 95% boys, cabin crew, 90% girls. And so it goes. At the age of 4, So if we wait for 10 years until they're 14 to engage with them in careers education, and we allow the stereotype to cement for 10 years, we must stop kidding ourselves that we can still make a difference. First finding. Second finding, the behavior did not change. So the choices of 14-year-olds were identical to the choices of 4-year-olds. So despite all the big talk about STEM, for example, or STEAM, we need to ask ourselves some questions. What's making a difference here? And what's not making a difference is girls outperforming boys in tests. Because when they come to make their career choices, they revert back to stereotype. You know, the black girl from a disadvantaged area who's never seen a black female pilot is not very likely to aspire to be one. So we need to think around the role model piece.
Mhm.
The third finding was that globally, almost all girls choose activities below the age range. 9-year-old girls choose 7-year-olds activities. 9-year-old boys choose 9 or 10-year-olds activities. And that says something around self-confidence, self-esteem, but probably also about the expectations that society has of girls in terms of their social mobility and their aspiration. Then the other finding is, of course, children can only aspire to what they know exists. So to phrase it badly, poor children make poor choices.
So if we look at that giant data set and we compare that to what you've seen over your career, Rhonda, in maybe in micro, what correlations are you recognizing, and which things have you seen? And maybe our context here is very different,
Mhm.
but I'm interested to know what resonates with you, or if there's any challenges you see.
So I've been in education for 30 years, and from admissions on the university side, and now in university counseling since 2005, so 18 years. And primarily I've worked with very affluent, privileged populations. So when you talk about, you know, the disadvantage in Sheffield, I'm thinking about some of the populations I've worked with, and you know, their vision, their aspirations, it's very different, you know, it's very different. And they aspire to things that, you know, that they see. And it's just quite a different experience than the populations that you're talking about. Your astronaut story reminded me of a program here that we did a few years ago, and that was career conversations tied to the Holland codes. You know, John Holland, the educational psychologist, you know, that all careers can be grouped into 5 different areas. So I had students do an activity, a questionnaire, which they love. They absolutely adore doing these questionnaires where they can see the results that tell them something about themselves. So through the Holland Code exercise, you know, they figured out, are they the creative, are they the thinker, the builder, whatever. And then I had this career conversations program bringing in professionals in each of the 5 different Holland Code areas. So Anne came in, and she was in the thinking category, and Anne's job and her background is in psychology, but she also actually worked for NASA, designing the interior of space capsules, keeping in mind the well-being and mental health state of astronauts. You know, so I love when things cross over and mix, and students don't think in silos. That, you know, wow, there is someone that has to consider the interior design of a space capsule and the materials and the durability of something flying around in space, but its impact on somebody's mental health. And so, as I said, we had career speakers in each of these areas, and it really just expanded the thinking of students. I want to circle back to what you were talking about with technology and the question that Kyra posed, and I'm kind of reverse engineering our program in a way. I'm introducing students to jobs of the future and what are the skills of the future. And a few of them that we're really focusing on now is caring, connecting, and coaching. And how many careers in the future will encompass these areas. And so to the technology point and the growth of AI, there's actually going to be a need for more man-machine managers, this interface of how humans and machines cooperate. Or we already hear and see this about, in the medical field, how AI and technology and people can walk around with things that is measuring their heart rate, their blood pressure, all of these data points. They don't have to go into a doctor's office to do this. So, that's caring, the connecting, and just looking at these skills and the applicability for jobs of the future. And it wakes them up and talk about what's the relevance to their learning. And I just always see that spark when you can talk about their future and not just have it focused on the here and now and, oh, this internal assessment is due next week, but seeing the bigger picture.
I agree. And I think the overall reaction out there to AI and ChatGPT was very disappointing, because I think we live in a maybe, hopefully only for the time being, in quite a pessimistic world. So the focus was all about the damage it was going to do and not about the brilliance it would allow us to be part of and the awe and wonder. And I think we need to kind of balance some of this. I think there's an interesting point you raised about the specific context of your school in terms of socioeconomic advantage or disadvantage. And I'd use two examples, because again, it goes to how well we know our children. So firstly, what's important from a society and an economy point of view is that when we talk about raising the bar, that the whole bar gets raised. It isn't just about certain groups, because all that will happen otherwise is that the gap between have and have not, can and cannot, will get bigger. And that would be to the detriment of everybody. And that understanding, I think, is very important. But 2 points really, and they are anecdotes, but I think important ones. When I was in charge of the Children's University, which I'd set up, I was approached by Eton College, the then headmaster, Tony Little, who became a friend. And Tony's view was that Eton needed the Children's University, which I didn't quite understand, because I thought, well, there's some of the most advantaged young people in the country. And his view was, which was a long conversation, his view essentially was that not through their own doing, of course, that quite a few of his young people were so disconnected from reality that they needed programs like this to know what it's like in the real world. His words were, it is quite possible that there is a future prime minister amongst one of these boys, and I wouldn't quite want a future prime minister to be like the current one, out of touch. So what happened was, we devised a program whereby the youngsters, led by a brilliant young man called Horden Farr, that the youngsters at Eton helped run the Children's University in the state schools in Slough, right? And both benefited. Horden Farr was the nephew of a good friend of mine called Joel Cadbury, of the Cadbury family, and Joel's story and mine are quite interesting. So I was the first one in my family to go to university, and my teachers had to persuade my parents to go to university, because typically the trend at the time in the south of the Netherlands was you went and worked in the coal mines, because that's where everybody else was, or at least in connected industries. So my teachers persuaded my parents that I should go to university, and the rest, as they say, is history. Joel Cadbury, who went to Eton, was the only one in his year group not to go to university. And he had some persuasion to do to tell his parents and his teachers that he wanted to go and work. And again, it goes back to that personalization, doesn't it? And the more we widen horizons and the more we provide experiences, the better rounded our young people will be. And I think that for me is a key issue. It is also a key issue that everybody has a responsibility to make sure that our societies move on. I mean, there was one of the issues that you raise in your questions, which is what is changing fast. And I think we've talked about a lot of what's changing fast and what is stuck. Mm-hmm. And I think what is stuck is to do with equity and equality, which I think the COVID period shone a light on, and that the gap is getting bigger rather than smaller. Even in our wealthy European societies, the gap is getting bigger. And what we need to understand, that this is not an issue, of course it is, it is an issue for individuals and individual families, but it is also an issue for the whole of society. Because if we don't develop everybody, what will our future workforces, capabilities and capacities and confidences look like? And that is something, and this incidentally is very basic. It is basic that there are schools in England, not too far away from where I am now, where during COVID, 35% of the children initially didn't have internet access at home. I'm talking basics. And I think that for all the, it's ironic, isn't it? We were talking about AI and everything that technology can do, but only for some. And nobody is going to be served by that. We need to really understand that there is such a thing as society, and that wherever we are in that socioeconomic universe, wherever we are, we have a role to play in. It's that kind of corporate, that collective responsibility bit. Like COP28 is going on at the moment, and everybody's talking about climate change for a week, and then everybody goes home until COP29. It's a collective responsibility. If we don't all individually do this, it has no chance. The state of our society, the state of our economy is a very similar thing. It is a collective responsibility. And if there are those, and clearly are, who are more fortunate than others for whatever reason, then perhaps in certain areas they have a greater role to play.
I think I'll circle back here to the mission and vision, because I know that that Rachel will mention it a lot, and she talks about it in almost every episode we have. She goes back to that sense of BFIS being unashamedly optimistic about creating students who want to go out and make the world a better place and leave the world better than they found it. So service is woven through, kind of the DNA of the school, and it's something that we're looking to develop in terms of these links to parents who also have, service, altruism, service to society in their work, in their places of work, in their outlooks, so that we can connect students to those folks more readily. And I guess my very last question, which is really for Rhonda about the context of our students, but then I would love, if you have time, Gail, your thoughts on that, is what is the biggest challenge for a BFIS kid in learning to, Gail has this wonderful phrase, which is learning to become me. What is the biggest challenge for our students in becoming themselves in our context? And maybe you then have some suggestions for us on how we can work on that. But I'd love to hear what you're coming up against.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the biggest challenge is the need to get outside of the bubble that they're in and really see the world as it is. Compared to other places that I've lived, service isn't woven into a student's experiences. They don't have as much easy access to it. For whatever reason, there's just these kind of barriers or just lack of opportunities to come into service much more easily than you see in the United States. And it's something that troubles me, but I think that the understanding of me and themselves is greatly expanded when they do get out of their comfort zone. And while I'm a university counselor, so I always have that hat on too. And too often a family's response to this is, okay, go on these very expensive week-long community service projects in Costa Rica, or someone, to build a school, etc. But it's not what I mean, and what I think brings long-standing change and impact to a student. It would be better within their community on a sustained basis instead of these kind of one-off trips.
And that's the feedback you get from universities, included in they're talking about how they value service. What they're looking for is real interactions. Real, meaningful.
Impact, but in a sustained way. I mean, what does that tell us when you're paying, I don't know, 3,000 euros for a trip to go to Thailand to build toilets or something? When that money could go somewhere else, and then you're out of that environment. And part of that trip is a week spent at the beach too. No, again, when I was in admissions for 13 years, university admissions, what I think some admissions officers might look even down upon something like that. But what impresses them is a commitment, ideally in their own community, doesn't have to be, but that's of a longstanding nature, that's really bringing around about change.
Yeah, I know we're over time, but do you have any last words for us on that?
Yeah, I think a couple of observations. I think firstly, I would look to a school like yours within its context to be a lead unto your young people. Most importantly, to be a leader in communities. And to make that difference in all sorts of ways. Sometimes those ways are not even measurable, shock, horror, but sometimes they're not. And I think there is something about, we need to redefine existing definitions of independent state school partnerships. We need to deliberately go out and form new communities, new partnerships for today's values, utilizing technology and all those things. And I think I would love to see that more. And I think that schools like yours have such, and your young people and their families, and have such an important role to play in this. I think the other thing in terms of the advice, in terms of the whole becoming me thing for your young people, is my advice would be very simple. And I think it's the biggest challenge. And it is, stay true to yourself. There are so many influences, good and bad. It is so difficult to ascertain what the truth is these days. You put a question into Google, and in my day, I cycled to the library and found the answer. And you put a question into Google, and my daughter has to judge which one out of the 500 answers is more likely to be the right one than the other. Those kind of skill sets, and they're not just mechanical exercises, are they? They're often linked to values and emotional values as well as others. And then I think I'd like to end with a quote of my favorite Barcelonian, really. And the quote is very much like the quote which my very first head teacher on my very first working day 40 years ago at a school called Taverham High School just outside Norwich in England gave me just before I went to take my first register. She tapped me on the shoulder and she said, "Go and enjoy yourself." And the Cruyff quote, "Salid y disfrutad," just before the 1992 European Champions League final against Sampdoria. It was all he said to his players. And we need to keep saying that to our young people, particularly in this world at the moment, which looks overcast and a bit grey. We need to remind them that the other side of the clouds, there is sunshine. And because otherwise they might forget. And so I stick with Cruyff from beginning to the end.
Thank you for rounding up this wonderful interview, which is, we haven't had enough time to hear all of your amazing ideas, both of you, but thank you for rounding up with words from our home context, which always puts us back right in the middle of, you know, where we are, what this setting allows us to be able to do for our students, and what they have access to here, and the beauty of being in the city. But also, thank you so much for being a thought partner with us on how we can improve and continue to grow the future pathways aspect of the program here, because there's so much you say that we recognize and see within the context here. And I think, you know, Rhonda, you've also done a fantastic job in making sure that the programming is growing, adapting, changing. And I love the idea of opening windows, twitching curtains, opening doors, you know, just, letting new fresh air in. I think that's what you both do in your contexts. So thank you so much.
Experience is everything. As we build our program here at BFIS, we listen to thinkers like Professor Geir Gauss and apply his ideas and others to our context and time. Thank you for sharing your conversation, Geir, Rhonda and Kyra. Join us for more insights and opinions, examples of our work, celebrations of what we do, and spotlights on our students and alumni in our upcoming episodes of our BFIS podcast. Thank you for listening.